Libya listed nearly 400 combat aircraft in 2011. Soviet MiG-25 interceptors could reach 3 times the speed of sound. French Mirage fighters stood beside 11 Tupolev Tu-22 bombers. The fleet came from 3 suppliers. Libya bought aircraft from the Soviet Union, France, and Italy across 4 decades, then backed them with hundreds of surface-to-air missile systems. On paper, it was huge. Then, NATO intervened in March 2011. No Libyan aircraft shot down a coalition plane. Most never left the ground. Within days, one of Africa's largest air forces had ceased to act. The aircraft remained on empty runways. That collapse began decades earlier with the man who seized power in 1969. Muammar Gaddafi inherited a small air arm that still depended on a few American F-5 fighters. The United States had delivered those aircraft to the Kingdom of Libya in 1967. An American training mission supported them. Within months of the coup, Washington withdrew that detachment, while Britain slowed its own delivery plans for modern equipment. A gap opened. France stepped into it in January 1970. Paris signed a contract for 110 Dassault Mirage 5 fighters, a purchase valued at $400 million. For Libya, it was a huge order. Gaddafi did not intend to keep every Mirage at home. He wanted aircraft that Egypt could use against Israel without Cairo negotiating directly with a Western supplier constrained after the 1967 war. France knew the purpose and completed the sale. French officials also saw a chance to widen France's influence in Arab countries. If Paris refused, the Soviet Union could take the order. Then the markings changed. Dozens of Libyan Mirages passed to Egypt, received Egyptian identification markings, and Egyptian pilots flew them during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The transfer did not end there. After the fighting, the aircraft returned to Libya. Egypt's pilots had used Libya's French jets in combat, and Libya recovered them afterward. The Soviet Union then emerged as the second major supplier. The returning Mirages did not remain alone for long. Within a year of the coup, Soviet freighters brought tanks and aircraft into Libya. The orders kept coming. Libya bought MiG-21s, then MiG-23s, and later MiG-25 interceptors. Soviet deliveries continued for 2 decades. The fleet changed fast. Soviet technicians now stood beside French-trained crews on the same runways. Different aircraft, different equipment. Moscow also sold Libya Tu-22 supersonic bombers, a type almost no other foreign air force flew. 11 arrived during the 1970s. Libya became the largest export operator of that bomber. Italy added another layer. Italian firms supplied primary trainers, light attack aircraft, repairs, and overhaul contracts. Their work grew as the aircraft aged. By the late 1970s, American-trained pilots flew French fighters while Italian contractors repaired aircraft near Soviet interceptors. Each purchase brought another supplier, another set of specialists, and another maintenance burden. The problem was not pilots alone. It was logistics. A French Mirage and a Soviet MiG shared no parts, fuel requirements, weapons, avionics, or ground equipment. Libya received more than 60 MiG-25s. Those interceptors brought a separate burden to every Libyan airbase. Their components did not fit the French Mirages. The fuel differed. So did the weapons, avionics, ground equipment, and maintenance procedures. One technician could not move from a Mirage to a MiG with the same tools or training. Each base needed separate stocks, test gear, specialists, and repair routines for each aircraft. Depots had to divide their shelves by type. Nothing could be swapped across the flight line. Libya kept French Mirages beside MiGs from several generations, Soviet Sukhoi strike aircraft, and Italian training aircraft. American transport aircraft and helicopters later joined the force. Every new type added a supply route back to another country. That route depended on Tripoli's ties with the supplier. When Moscow cooled relations, MiG spare parts stopped arriving. When relations with Western suppliers soured, another source of support could close. The shortages now reached the cockpit. A pilot could climb into an interceptor that lacked one part for its next sortie. After relations with Moscow cooled, MiG parts dried up. Then came the American strikes on Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986, following the Berlin disco bombing. French and Italian deliveries became harder to secure. More than half of Libya's combat aircraft often sat in storage, grounded by missing parts. 50 MiG-23 MS interceptors entered the fleet. Only 24 remained airworthy across 2 squadrons. The rest stayed parked from delivery and never entered combat service. Training added another risk. Libyan pilots trained in the Soviet Union, Egypt, and Libya under uneven standards. Many flew fewer than 100 hours a year. That left limited time to master an aircraft whose maintenance could stop before the next flight. The remaining MiG-23 MS stayed in storage from the day they arrived. While only 24 MiG-23 MS aircraft remained available, Gaddafi kept enlarging Libya's visible air fleet. He had pursued that image for 40 years. The aircraft mattered beyond their immediate combat value. Gaddafi cast himself first as a pan-Arab leader, then as a pan-African one. A large armed force reinforced that claim. Air power sat at its center, even as more aircraft required storage and repair. Libya's defense spending rose from roughly 1.1% of gross domestic product in 2001 to around 3% by 2007. Part of that money went to keep the Air Force alive. Other aircraft waited for a future war. Gaddafi intended some purchases for a conflict with Israel. Libya shared no border with Israel. Its forces lacked the means to project air power into the Levant for such a war. So aircraft arrived and went straight into storage. They were reserved for a conflict that never came. In 2007, Libya's defense spending reached about $1.74 billion. Money could buy contracts, but it could not reopen maintenance lines cut years earlier. In 1988, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie brought international sanctions down on Libya. The restrictions lasted for more than a decade. Spare parts became scarce. Existing supplier conflicts turned maintenance into a trap. The sanctions restricted Libya's ability to operate and service its aircraft. Old Mirage F-1 fighters and Sukhoi aircraft entered repair programs, but crews still faced incompatible equipment and missing components. In 2003, Libya accepted responsibility for Lockerbie and paid compensation to victims' families. The sanctions then ended. 5 years later, Russia agreed to erase $4.5 billion of Soviet-era Libyan debt. New arms contracts came with that deal. MiG-29 fighters, Su-30 aircraft, S-300 air defense systems, and attack helicopters entered the talks. Italian and Russian overhaul programs tried to return aging aircraft to service. The repairs added more suppliers and more separate fixes. Libya had aircraft again. It still lacked one fleet that crews could maintain together. The weakness had already appeared in Chad. A Libyan pilot could face a Stinger team with little warning. During the 1980s, Libya intervened in Chad's civil conflicts. Su-22 strike aircraft supported Allied factions. Other Libyan aircraft joined them. The aircraft gave Libyan forces support in the early fighting, but they did not stop Chad's mobile units. Chadian fighters crossed open ground in pickup trucks. Machine guns stood in their beds. The United States supplied them with shoulder-fired Stinger missiles. Expensive aircraft met crews who could move, fire, and disappear before a response arrived. On September 5, 1987, Chadian forces crossed the border and struck Matan al-Sara Air Base. The base stood almost 100 kilometers inside Libya. Pickup trucks with mounted machine guns reached the airfield. Several aircraft burned on the ground. The attackers lost little. A month earlier, Stinger missiles had already brought down at least one Su-22 and one MiG-23 over Chad. Chadian forces captured one Libyan pilot. Aircraft existed in large numbers. Crews still could not turn them into control of the battlefield. The warning came years before the Air Force began breaking apart from within. Before the raid, Stinger missiles had downed at least one Su-22 and one MiG-23, and Chadian forces captured a pilot. The earlier combat failures had already exposed crews under pressure. In February 2011, that pressure turned inward as protests against Gaddafi's government became an armed rebellion. Orders sent Libyan Air Force pilots against protesters in Benghazi and other eastern cities. The order came fast. On February 21st, 2 Mirage F-1 pilots heard their engines rise on the airfield, then rejected orders to bomb anti-government protesters. They set course for Malta. Both aircraft landed there. Their flight showed that the men assigned to suppress the uprising could refuse the mission itself. More pilots left in the following weeks, and senior officers abandoned posts at air bases near Tripoli. Gaddafi was losing trained crews and commanders before the Air Force could be used decisively against the revolt. On March 17th, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1973. It authorized a no-fly zone and the protection of civilians. 2 Mirage F-1s sat on Malta, not over Benghazi. The missing Mirage crews left loyalist positions exposed. 2 days after the UN resolution, American-led Operation Odyssey Dawn opened from the sea. American and British ships and submarines launched more than 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Night flashes cut across the water. The missiles struck Libyan command targets and fixed air defense sites. SA-2, SA-3, and SA-5 positions took the first blows. Those missile sites had guarded Libyan airspace for decades. Their loss opened the route for sustained coalition attacks from above. By the end of March, NATO took command under Operation Unified Protector. The aircraft kept flying. Over more than 7 months, NATO flew more than 26,000 sorties. Nearly 9,700 were strike sorties. Libyan forces brought down no coalition aircraft in aerial combat or with guided surface-to-air missiles. Low-flying aircraft and helicopters still faced unguided shoulder-fired missiles and small arms fire. But the fixed positions were gone. SA-2, SA-3, and SA-5 no longer covered Libyan skies. With Libya's air defenses suppressed, the argument shifted to what NATO's strikes were achieving. Several strikes killed civilians. Critics said the mission had moved beyond civilian protection and toward removing Gaddafi. Those disputes did not restore loyalist air power. Gaddafi's remaining air force rarely left the ground, and its crews could not challenge coalition control overhead. Sorties came sporadically. Most achieved little. NATO's later assessment said the Libyan Air Force posed no threat throughout the campaign. Then, on May 7th, Gaddafi's forces sent SF-260 light attack aircraft toward Misrata. The aircraft set rebel-held fuel depots on fire, and NATO did not intercept the raid. Flames rose over the stores. It was a real strike. But one raid changed nothing. Loyalist aircraft still lacked the reach and frequency to contest coalition control of the sky. NATO's own assessment gave the final measure. Libya's air force presented no threat during the whole campaign. That imbalance left space for other Libyan aircraft. The self-proclaimed Free Libyan Air Force used captured and defected planes, taking risks loyalist pilots rarely took. On March 15, 2011, defected MiG-23 jets and MiG-24 helicopter crews flew combat sorties near Ajdabiya. They struck loyalist positions and naval vessels. Rotor noise carried over the front. A small number of rebel MiG-21 fighters escorted transport aircraft carrying supplies toward besieged rebel-held cities. Those missions crossed NATO's no-fly zone, imposed to keep Gaddafi's own aircraft grounded. NATO usually intercepted the rebel planes, then escorted them back to base instead of shooting them down. The defections gave the rebels aircraft and crews. NATO's restraint kept supply flights moving, but those sorties never controlled the sky. By October 2011, Gaddafi was dead and his government had collapsed. With Gaddafi gone, airfields and aircraft remained, but armed groups now held the country apart. The collapse left no single command for Libya's pilots. In mid-2012, the post-Gaddafi government drew up plans for a new air force. The list named Rafales, Typhoons, more Mirages, Hercules transports, and Chinook helicopters. On paper, the fleet looked broad. On the ground, the country could not rebuild it. Within a few years, a second civil war began. Rival governments and militias took pieces of the old fleet. Aircraft from Gaddafi's era sat on separate ramps and flew for competing factions. Forces aligned with the Government of National Unity based themselves in Tripoli and used Misrata as a major base. The remaining Gaddafi aircraft went to rival factions. More than 100 embargo breaches each year kept Libya's divided air group supplied after the old fleet split apart. The Eastern Wing answered to Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army. Few aircraft could fly. Both camps held fragments of Gaddafi's inventory, aging Soviet and French airframes, with only a small share still airworthy. The United Nations embargo had covered every faction since 2011. It remained in force. Yet, United Nations experts recorded more than 100 violations a year, linking outside backers to aircraft, spare parts, and combat support. The United Arab Emirates gave Haftar's forces covert aerial support. Its combat aircraft reportedly struck targets inside Libya. The expert reports documented the breaches. Outside support kept the rival factions supplied. Yet nearly 400 aircraft from the former Air Force remained entries on a list. That list included Soviet interceptors, French fighters, and Tu-22 bombers. The numbers looked large. The aircraft did not form one usable force. Different arms deals had produced fleets with different parts, weapons, training needs, and maintenance demands. Sanctions restricted supplies. Years of neglected servicing left airframes silent on their parking stands. March 2011 exposed the condition of the fleet. NATO planners quickly found no serious air threat waiting above Libya. Most of Gaddafi's aircraft never left the ground. They could not. Today, two aviation groups remain. Both depend on outside subsidies. But the core problem had appeared long before their split. Almost 400 aircraft existed on paper, while most could not take off in March 2011. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.